I've always liked being outdoors. Not the crowded, noisy kind of outdoor where people fill every trail or campfire circle. I mean the deep, quiet woods, where the trees stand tall and thick, and the only sounds are birds, wind, and sometimes the rustle of a deer slipping away. There's a kind of peace in that. And when Max came into my life, a lean black Labrador with a sharp nose and sharper instincts, those woods became my refuge. In the summer of 2014, I decided to get away from the city for a while. Work was wearing me down, and I could feel myself losing something I hadn't quite named. Maybe it was calm, maybe it was clarity. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It was about 20 miles from the nearest town, reached by a dirt road that was barely maintained. The owner, a retired ranger named Carl, said the place was perfect if I wanted solitude. The cabin had no electricity and no running water, but it had a stove, a small well, and enough space for me and Max. I arrived late one August afternoon. The sun was low, slanting golden light through the trees as I pulled up the last stretch of the road. Max sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked, nose twitching. He liked the smell of the woods. I unloaded the car, grabbing the bags and a small cooler. The cabin was modest, pine logs darkened by age, a stone chimney on one side, a porch with a few creaky wooden chairs. Inside, the air smelled like dry wood and earth, the floorboards rough beneath my feet. I set down my things and lit a fire in the stove, the crackling flames giving the room a warm glow. I'd brought a few books, some canned food, and plenty of water. My plan was simple: stay a week, walk the trails, fish in the nearby stream, and keep Max company. No phone, no internet, just the woods and us. That first night, after eating a simple meal and cleaning up, I sat on the porch with Max lying at my feet. The sky was a dark canvas scattered with stars. The only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the occasional call of an owl. I felt a deep kind of quiet settle over me, the city noise fading away like a distant memory. The next morning, I woke early. Max was already up, nose to the ground, sniffing the air with eager curiosity. I brewed some coffee over the stove and packed a small bag with essentials: water, a knife, a flashlight, and some jerky for Max. The plan was to follow an old logging trail Carl had mentioned, a path he said hadn't been used for decades but was still passable. The trail started narrow and twisted through thick stands of oak and maple. Max stayed close, ears twitching, nose low to the ground. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No cars, no planes, just the slow whisper of wind through the leaves. Occasionally, I spotted a squirrel darting up a tree or the flash of a bird's wings. The ground underfoot was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. After a couple of hours, the trail opened up near a small clearing. A fallen log lay across the path, moss growing thick on its bark. I sat there for a while, letting Max drink from a shallow pool nearby. The sun was warm but softened by the shade. I could hear a distant babble of water, probably the creek Carl had mentioned. The forest felt safe here like it always had. We turned back and headed toward the cabin, but as the afternoon wore on, a strange feeling began to crawl up my spine. It was subtle at first, a slight unease like someone watching from just beyond sight. Max noticed it too, his ears twitching, tail stiffening. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar woods playing tricks on my mind. Still, I kept my eyes sharp. That evening, as darkness fell and the fire burned low, I heard something outside the cabin, a soft snapping of twigs. Max growled low, standing by the door, his body tense. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow slip between the trees. Then nothing, just the rustle of leaves in the night wind. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that the forest was home to hunters, campers, maybe other hikers. I locked the door and checked the windows. Max stayed close, his breathing steady now. Still, sleep didn't come easy. The next day was overcast, heavy clouds hanging low. I went out to fetch water from the well, Max at my side. The woods felt different in the gray light, colors muted and shadows deeper. I tried to shake the nervous feeling from the night before. After all, I was a grown man in a place I chose to be alone with my dog. Nothing could hurt me, but as the day went on, I noticed more signs that unsettled me. Footprints around the cabin, too large to be a deer, and not the neat paw prints Max left. They were human. Someone had been here or was here. I searched the perimeter carefully but found no other signs. No trash, no dropped items, just the prints leading away into the woods. That night, I kept the fire burning late. Max lay with one eye open, alert. I stayed awake longer than usual, flashlight in hand, watching the dark edges of the trees. At one point, I thought I heard a faint voice carried on the wind, like someone calling, but when I strained to listen, it was gone. Sleep finally came in small, restless bursts. The third day was the worst. I'd gone out early to gather wood and noticed the footprints again, closer this time. They led from the woods right up to the cabin door. My stomach twisted. Someone was near. I grabbed the hunting knife I'd brought for emergencies and kept Max close. We stayed inside most of the day, checking the windows, making sure all was secure. I thought about calling the ranger station, but there was no cell service. Carl had told me the nearest payphone was miles away, in the town of Kane. That night, I couldn't stop hearing noises. Footsteps crunching on dry leaves, distant snapping of branches, soft thuds near the porch. Max was restless, growling at the windows, his body stiff as a board. I stayed awake, my back against the door, watching the flashlight beam as it swept the darkness. Then, suddenly, the beam caught something. A man standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in shadow. The man didn't move. I could see his eyes reflecting the light. He was silent, but I knew he was watching. My heart pounded, and I held my breath, waiting for whatever would come next. After a long minute, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I locked all the doors again, pulled the curtains tight, and sat with Max, feeling the cold dread settle deep in my bones. The next morning, I debated leaving, but the dirt road was blocked by a fallen tree, probably from last week's storm. No way to drive out. I was stuck. I tried to keep busy, gathering more wood, checking traps I set for small game. Max was on high alert, never leaving my side. We stayed inside when night came, lights off, only the fire flickering. Over the next 2 days, the presence grew bolder. I found discarded cans near the back of the cabin, cigarette butts that weren't mine, and more footprints circling the cabin. I realized whoever was out there was watching me, maybe waiting for a chance. One evening, as dusk fell, I heard something move near the back porch. Max barked sharply and ran outside. I followed, flashlight in hand, but Max was gone into the dark. For what felt like forever, I called for him, voice cracking, then a bark, close and urgent. I moved toward the sound, heart racing. There, tangled in a wire snare someone had set up, was Max. His leg was caught tight. I freed him quickly, checking for wounds. He whimpered but seemed okay. I carried him inside and cleaned the cut. That night, Max stayed in my lap, trembling but alive. The next morning, I decided to hike out on foot to get help. I packed light, water, the knife, some food. Max limped but walked beside me. The forest was thicker than I remembered, the trail rough and overgrown. The fear I felt wasn't just about the man who'd been watching us anymore. It was about the wilderness itself, about being alone, about how thin the line was between safety and danger. After hours of walking, exhausted and thirsty, I finally reached the ranger station. They took my story seriously and sent a patrol back to the cabin. The officers found signs of someone living in the woods, a makeshift camp, stolen supplies from the cabin, and some personal items. No one was caught, but they increased patrols in the area. Max and I never went back to that cabin. I still think about those nights. The feeling of being watched, the shadow in the trees, the sound of footsteps on dry leaves. It taught me that the woods are full of secrets, and sometimes the scariest thing isn't the darkness or the wild animals. It's the unknown people who hide just out of sight, waiting. Now, when I'm with Max, we stick to well-traveled paths and places where other people are nearby. The peace I once found in the solitude of the deep woods has changed, but so have I. That summer in the Allegheny forest is a story I carry with me, a reminder to respect the wild and always be prepared, because the real dangers aren't always obvious. Sometimes, they watch quietly from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step forward. It was late autumn in 2013, and I had just taken a seasonal job with the Forestry Commission in southern British Columbia. I was 31 at the time, single, and didn't have much tying me down in Calgary. I had bounced between jobs, fire watch, landscaping, fisheries surveys, but this gig promised solid pay and solitude, which I preferred. The assignment was to manage a small ranger station deep in the Muskwekachika wilderness for 4 weeks. The station was part of a fire prevention post, but it also doubled as a general check-in for hikers and hunters. Nothing fancy, just a 2-room wood cabin with a shortwave radio, logbooks, a cot, and a basic kitchen with propane tanks. I'd be alone most of the time, with only 2 weekly check-ins via satellite phone and the occasional supply drop by helicopter. I was given a rifle for bears, a flare gun, some bear spray, and enough food for the entire month. Cans of beans, rice, jerky, powdered eggs, coffee, and oatmeal. The cabin had no power except for a solar panel that powered a few lights and the radio. They flew me in on a bright Thursday morning, dropped me near the ridge where the cabin sat, and buzzed away fast. It didn't bother me. I liked quiet. It was thick pine all around, with only one trail leading out in either direction. One headed north to a lakeside outpost maybe 8 miles away. The other went south for nearly 20 miles before it connected to a logging road. The first week went smooth. I hiked the trails, noted any signs of illegal hunting or fire risk, and logged my observations. There were no visitors. I saw signs of elk, moose, even a cougar, but no people. Snowed lightly some nights, just dustings. I chopped wood, drank coffee by the stove, and slept well. On the 10th day, I woke up around 4 in the morning to a strange sound, like metal tapping on wood. I froze under my blanket. The sound was faint and inconsistent, not rhythmic, just sharp taps at uneven intervals. The cabin didn't have much insulation, and sound traveled easy. I lay still for a few minutes, listening. Nothing else, just the wind. I chalked it up to a tree branch or maybe ice melting off the roof and going through the gutter system. The sun rose around 7 and I went out to check. There was nothing around the cabin. No prints in the frost, no disturbed trees. I shrugged it off. Over the next few days, little things started to feel off. I'd leave the axe buried in a stump outside and find it leaning against the porch later. I thought maybe I was just being forgetful. I wasn't sleeping as well either, waking up at odd hours without a reason. I wasn't scared exactly, just alert. On the 15th day, things took a turn. I was halfway through my shift, and I had settled into a routine. That day, I decided to hike out to a small glade a few miles north where elk often pass through. I brought my notebook, binoculars, and my rifle just in case. I was out for about 4 hours. When I returned, I noticed something strange. One of the side windows of the cabin was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. I was sure of that. It was cold outside, and I kept everything sealed up unless I was airing out smoke from the stove. I walked around the cabin slowly, rifle slung but ready. I didn't see anyone. The door was locked as I had left it. I looked inside. Nothing seemed missing. No tracks around the windows either, just the disturbed latch. I shut it and tried to dismiss it. Maybe it hadn't closed properly before. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept the rifle close, and every sound outside made my pulse jump. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, that metallic tapping. But this time it was louder. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin. I got up and pressed my ear against the log wall. Nothing. Then I heard 3 distinct taps, sharp and deliberate. I grabbed my boots and jacket, loaded the rifle, and crept outside. The moon was full, casting a pale light across the clearing. Everything looked still. I circled the cabin with the rifle raised. No movement, no sound. I waited for nearly 30 minutes before going back in. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Behind the cabin, at the base of the back wall, someone had carved something into the wood. It wasn't deep, just scratched enough to be seen clearly. It said, "Stay warm." I stared at it for a long time. The message was neat, not rushed. That meant someone had stood there for several minutes, completely unnoticed. I paced around the area, looking for prints, but the ground was frozen hard and covered in leaves and pine needles. Nothing showed. I went inside and locked everything. My hands shook as I boiled coffee. I didn't report it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe I was afraid they'd pull me out early and I'd lose the contract. I convinced myself it was some hunter playing a joke. Maybe someone who had stumbled on the cabin and left a weird message. 2 nights later, it escalated. I was sleeping lightly when I heard a creak on the porch, distinct and slow. Then another. I sat up, heart pounding. I had blocked the door with a chair before bed. I looked toward it and saw the shadow of someone moving outside. They were just standing in front of the door, not knocking, not trying to enter, just standing. I gripped the rifle and waited. I don't know how long. It felt like hours. Eventually, the shadow moved away. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went outside and saw fresh mud on the porch. A single boot print. It was narrow and deep. Someone had stood there for a long time. I measured it against mine, smaller, probably a size 9. Definitely not mine. I scanned the forest, yelling out to anyone, but no one answered. I hiked a full mile in each direction and saw nothing. That evening, I finally used the satellite phone and called my supervisor. I told him someone was messing around near the cabin. He said it was probably a lost hiker or an off-trail hunter and that I should keep the door locked. They'd send someone to check the area during the next supply drop in 5 days. 5 days. Couldn't sleep that night. I kept a fire going, the rifle loaded, and all the windows shut tight. Around 3 in the morning, I heard movement on the roof. Slow steps, deliberate. I held my breath. Then a thump. Something landed on the ground beside the cabin. I peeked through the window and caught the back of someone disappearing into the trees. Person in a dark coat. No flashlight, just gone. The next morning, I found a pile of animal bones arranged in a circle behind the cabin. Small ones, rabbits, maybe a squirrel. It was meticulous, cleaned and stacked in a perfect ring. I swept them away and burned them. I didn't leave the cabin again. For the next 3 days, the forest felt alive. Not with animals or birds, but with presence. Like something was watching. I kept the fire burning, even when I had to break into the emergency wood stash. On the day of the scheduled supply drop, I waited outside with the flare gun in hand. But no chopper came. The clouds were thick and heavy. By late afternoon, it began snowing heavily, thick, wet flakes that stuck to everything. Visibility dropped to near zero. I stayed up all night, hoping they'd come in the morning. They didn't. The tapping started again, this time on the window. I didn't move, just sat in the dark, holding the rifle. The tapping came every hour on a different wall, like someone circling. On the 20th day, I found another message, scratched into the wood under the window. "Are you cold?" That broke something in me. I stopped eating. My mind ran in loops. I started imagining things. Footsteps that weren't there, creaks that meant nothing. I kept the flare gun ready and aimed at the treeline for hours, hoping to see something. Anything. Day 24. The snow let up and the clouds thinned. Around noon, I finally heard the chopper. I ran into the clearing and fired the flare. The red burst lit up the gray sky, and the helicopter dipped low. When they landed, I ran to the pilot. I must have looked like a madman. Dirty, hollow-eyed, barely able to speak. A second ranger stepped out and asked what had happened. I didn't answer. I just pointed to the carvings. They loaded me in, and I didn't look back at the cabin. They never found the person. Rangers swept the area for days. Nothing. No prints, no campsites, no gear. They ruled it as unconfirmed human activity. I left the job, moved back to Calgary, and started working at a car lot. I didn't talk about it for years, but sometimes, on cold nights, when I hear wind against the siding or snow tapping the window, I remember those scratches, and I can still feel it, that presence. Not a ghost, not a monster, just someone who lives further off the grid than I ever did. Watching, waiting, knowing you're alone, and liking it. My name is Kevin Morton. I was 38 when I inherited my uncle's farm in western Iowa, a stretch of flat, lonely land just outside a place called Lanesboro. That was in the fall of 2019, after he passed away from a heart attack while baling hay. He was 69 and had lived there alone since his wife left him back in the 80s. I hadn't seen him in 10 years. The farm came with everything. 80 acres, a rust-red barn, broken down machinery, and a tiny two-room cabin he'd built himself about 30 years earlier. It sat near the edge of a wooded lot at the far side of the fields, just past a crumbling stone wall that once marked the original boundary line. The cabin was isolated from the house and barn, maybe 500 yards away through overgrown grass and a dirt path that hadn't been used in years. I'd come up from Kansas City, where I'd been laid off from a landscaping job in early August. My marriage had gone cold by then, maybe long before that, if I'm honest, and when the letter from the lawyer came, it felt like some kind of sign. Something about open air, a clean break. My wife didn't argue. She just asked if she could keep the dog. I said yes. I didn't have a plan. I figured I'd sort the place out, maybe sell off the equipment, and see if I could get the fields leased to one of the locals. But the truth is, once I got out there, I liked the quiet. The silence had weight to it. I could hear myself think again, or I thought I could. The first few weeks were uneventful. The days were warm, dry, and bright. I cleared weeds around the barn, patched some roof shingles, and hauled old scrap metal to a yard in Carroll. The nights were cool, and I'd sleep on a cot in the cabin, surrounded by the hum of insects and the creak of old timber. There was no electricity out there, but I brought a battery lantern and a propane stove. I didn't mind the lack of comfort. One of the first things I noticed about the farm was the way the land curved in strange places. It was mostly flat, but not all of it sat right. The field to the west, for example, sloped just slightly downward toward a grove of black walnut trees. When I stood at the barn and looked out, the land seemed to fall away faster than it should have. I remember checking the topographical map once. Nothing strange showed up, just a standard contour. But it felt wrong. I started spending more time in the cabin, especially after the roof of the main house started leaking during a thunderstorm. The cabin had its problems too. Rot near the floor, a soft spot near the bed, and mice, but it felt more honest. I fixed up a rain barrel outside, chopped firewood, and sealed the windows with plastic. I started to get used to being alone. But around the third week, little things started to happen. First, it was the wind. Not the usual breeze that ran across the fields, but something sharper, more localized. I'd feel it blow through the cracks in the cabin walls when the trees were still. One night, I woke up with the lantern swinging slightly, like someone had brushed past it. I told myself it was just air pressure, maybe a change in temperature. I went back to sleep. A few nights later, I heard movement outside. Footsteps, maybe soft and slow. I had no animals on the farm, and nothing large should have been out that way. It didn't sound like a deer. Too careful, too deliberate. I lay in the cot, holding my breath, heart pounding. It circled the cabin twice, then silence. I waited until morning, then went outside. Nothing. No prints in the soil, no signs of damage or animals. Just an empty clearing with grass crushed only where I had walked. I started carrying a flashlight and a knife to bed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just wildlife. Maybe a coyote or a fox, maybe even a raccoon. But I knew the sound of a four-legged animal. This had been 2 feet, heavy and slow. I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake up at odd hours, 2:30, 3:10, sometimes just after 4, always with the same feeling, someone nearby, watching. One night, I stayed up until dawn, staring out through the slit in the plastic-covered window, just darkness and my breath fogging the air. One morning, I found something odd near the woods, a pile of small bones, clean, white, and arranged in a neat circle about 6 feet across. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal thing, maybe coyotes again. But the bones were too varied. A bird skull, a rabbit femur, a few ribs I couldn't place. It didn't feel natural. I kicked them apart and moved on. About a week later, I was walking the western edge of the field when I saw a figure standing at the treeline. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but I could see a person, tall, still, facing me. I froze, raised my hand. The figure didn't move. After about 10 seconds, I turned and walked slowly back toward the cabin. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to show fear. I didn't hear footsteps, and when I turned around again, the figure was gone. That night, I slept in the barn with the pitchfork next to me. The next morning, I drove into town and told the sheriff what I'd seen. He was polite, older, looked like he'd spent too many years on the job. He said they'd check it out, but I could tell he didn't think much of it. Probably figured I was spooked by the isolation. Maybe he was right. Still, he gave me his card and said to call if it happened again. I stopped working the fields. I focused on the cabin, boarded up the windows, reinforced the door with a steel bracket from the barn. I made noise when I walked, tried to look confident, but I could feel it in my spine. Someone had been there, maybe still was. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, rotten meat, like something had died nearby and was being baked in the sun. I checked the crawl space beneath the cabin. Nothing. I checked the woods. Nothing. But the smell got worse every day, until I couldn't sit in the cabin without gagging. Then it went away, just gone, overnight. I stood in the clearing that morning, breathing deep, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But something had changed in the air, heavier, more still. I started keeping a journal, just small notes, times, smells, sightings. I wrote down everything. I thought if I had a record, it would help me stay sane, that maybe I could make sense of it later. The figure came back on a cold evening in late October. I was standing in the field, just after sunset, lighting the lantern when I saw movement at the treeline again. Same place, but this time it wasn't still. It was walking slow, steady, toward the cabin. I dropped the lantern and ran, straight into the woods on the other side. I hid behind a fallen tree, heart in my throat. I waited. I could hear it walking, crunching the grass. Closer. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed hidden for 2 hours. When I finally made it back to the cabin, the door was open. The lock had been ripped off. Not picked. Broken. The mattress was torn apart. The floor had deep scratch marks in it, like someone had dragged something heavy. I called the sheriff again. This time they came out. 2 deputies. They looked around, asked questions, didn't write anything down. Said it was probably vandals, maybe drug addicts. I asked why nothing was stolen. They shrugged. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I took the old generator from the barn and hooked it up to the cabin. Wired in a single light bulb and a camera. One of those trail cams I'd picked up on sale years ago and never used. I pointed it at the clearing. That night, I stayed in the barn again. The wind was loud, banging loose siding against the wall. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked the camera. 1 image. 2:42 a.m. The light was on. The clearing was empty, mostly, but in the lower corner, just barely in frame, was a shape. A shoulder, maybe, part of a leg. No face. I zoomed in on my laptop. Grainy but real. Someone had stood just out of frame. Watching. Waiting. I packed everything that day. Threw my tools, clothes, and journal into the truck. I left the cabin unlocked. I didn't care anymore. I drove back to Kansas City. Stayed with a friend for a while. Got a job. Found a small apartment. Tried to forget. But I still dream about that place. 6 months later, in April of 2020, I got a letter from a neighboring farmer. His name was Gerald, and he'd taken over the field lease. He said he'd been walking the property and found something I might want to see. Against my better judgment, I drove back. The cabin was gone. Burned. Nothing left but blackened logs and ash. Gerald said it had happened in January. No cause found. No suspects. But it wasn't the fire that bothered me. It was what he'd found in the barn. In the back corner, buried under hay, he'd found my journal. Burnt around the edges, but mostly intact. I don't remember leaving it there. I remember packing it. I remember putting it in the front seat of the truck. But there it was. Inside the front cover was a new note, written in shaky block letters. You shouldn't have stayed. I haven't gone back since. I never will. But I still wake up some nights at 2:42 a.m., sweating, heart racing, wondering how close they got, wondering if they ever really left, and wondering who the hell they were. I never wanted to go back to the old hunting cabin. It belonged to my Uncle Mark, and I'd only been there once before when I was 15. That first time was during a dry winter in 2009. A week-long trip that ended with a bear encounter and a busted ATV. Even back then, I remembered something feeling off about the place, like the woods had a weight to them that pressed in on your chest. I didn't tell anyone that at the time. Figured it was just teenage anxiety or the altitude messing with me. But I never forgot it. 13 years later, I was 32, living in Denver, and scraping by on carpentry jobs while renting a basement suite in Aurora. Life wasn't awful, just colorless. I didn't have a wife or girlfriend, didn't really have any close friends either, just a few work guys I got a beer with every now and then. Most of my family had scattered. Uncle Mark had passed away 2 years earlier, and his wife sold off everything except the cabin. She tried to sell that too, but nobody wanted it. Not even the Forest Service. In August of 2022, I got a call from a lawyer handling the estate. Long story short, the cabin was mine now. I thought about just selling it or even tearing it down, but some weird part of me didn't want to let go of it until I saw it one more time. I told myself I'd take a few days, bring some supplies, clean it up, get some photos for listing it. That was the plan. The cabin sat deep in Route National Forest, northwest of Steamboat Springs, about a 4-hour drive from where I lived. You couldn't even reach it with a regular car. You had to park about 3 miles away and hike in. It sat in a thick tree line near a ridge with no neighbors for miles. No cell service. No power lines. It ran on propane and a backup generator that had probably rusted out by now. I left Denver early on a Friday morning, packed the truck with tools, food, water, and a Remington 870 that I hadn't shot in years, just in case there were bears again. I brought a trail cam too, wanted to set it up behind the cabin just to see what kind of wildlife was still out there. The kind of stuff you never see in the city. The hike in was rough. I parked where the logging road ended and followed a half-erased ATV trail into the woods. The trees got thicker the deeper I went. Pines, mostly, with a few dead aspens and old-growth firs that creaked with every gust of wind. It was late summer, but the shade made everything cold. I had a jacket on by the time I saw the cabin roof break through the trees. It hadn't changed much since 2009. The tin roof was rusted, and the wood siding had gone gray and warped in places. One of the front steps was rotted through. The old propane tank was still out back, sun-bleached and dented. Inside, the place smelled like mice and mold. I opened all the windows, swept out dead leaves, and tried not to gag when I saw what looked like a mummified rat under the couch. That first night was quiet. I made a fire in the wood stove, cooked some canned stew on a camp stove, and sat out on the porch with a flashlight and a beer. The forest at night was a whole different animal. Pitch black.
No moon.
No stars. Just tree silhouettes swaying in the breeze. But I felt it again, that pressure. That sensation I'd had when I was a teenager. Like I wasn't alone. Like the woods were holding their breath. The next morning, I set up the trail cam about 30 yards behind the cabin, facing downhill where a game trail crossed through the brush. I fixed the busted front step, reinforced the porch railing, and cleared out the chimney. By mid-afternoon, I was covered in sweat and dirt, but I felt halfway decent. Like I was doing something with my hands that actually mattered. That changed around sundown. I was sitting at the kitchen table eating jerky and crackers when I heard something brush against the cabin wall. A slow scrape, like fingers over rough wood. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited 20 seconds, maybe more, then grabbed the shotgun and stepped outside. Nothing, just trees. Shadows stretching long across the clearing. No wind.
No birds. No insects.
Total silence. I circled the cabin twice, flashlight sweeping across the trees, and didn't see a damn thing. I figured maybe it was a branch or even a deer, but deep down I knew better. That wasn't an animal sound. It was too deliberate, too slow. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside made my stomach clench. I kept the shotgun loaded and next to the bed. At one point, I thought I saw movement at the tree line. Something pale and low, but when I pointed the light, there was nothing there. By morning, I convinced myself I was just letting the isolation mess with my head. Still, I went out back to check the trail cam. There were only 2 images on it. One was just empty forest, around 10:30 p.m. The other, taken at 3:14 a.m., showed something standing at the edge of the clearing. It was hard to see clearly, but it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person either. The shape was wrong. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, but its limbs were too long, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes had caught the flash, 2 white discs staring dead on at the lens. I deleted the photo. I don't know why. I just panicked. My hand moved before I could stop it. I told myself I must have just imagined the details. Must have been a trick of the light. Coyote, a buck, anything but what it really looked like. I should have packed up then, left everything and gone back to the truck. But I didn't. I kept working on the cabin, cleaning, fixing, pretending nothing was wrong. That evening, just before dusk, I found tracks near the propane tank. Bare feet, human-shaped, but wrong. The toes were too long, almost finger-like, and they sank deep into the soft dirt like claws. There were 5 prints, each spaced too far apart to be walking. They weren't old. The soil was still damp underneath. I tried to rationalize it, thought maybe they were mine from earlier, even though I'd been wearing boots the whole time. I poured a line of salt across the thresholds, locked all the windows, and shoved furniture in front of the door. I didn't believe in superstitions, but fear does weird things to your brain. That night was different. Something was out there, and it wasn't afraid anymore. Around midnight, I heard it circling the cabin. I could tell from the crunch of leaves, slow steps, deliberate. Once, it scratched at the front door. Another time, I heard it tap the glass on the kitchen window, soft and slow, like nails. I stayed in bed with the shotgun, eyes wide open, every muscle in my body locked. It stayed out there until just before dawn. Then silence. When the sun came up, I went outside. No tracks, nothing touched, just that feeling in the air, thick and wrong, like the forest didn't want me there. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I packed everything I could carry into my pack, locked the cabin, and started hiking fast toward the truck. I didn't care about selling the place anymore. I just wanted to get out. About halfway back, maybe 1.5 miles from the cabin, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy ones. I turned around, nothing. I kept walking. They started again, not matching my pace, but just off. Too heavy for a deer, too slow for a bear. I stopped. So did they. I walked faster. They followed. Eventually, I broke into a jog, then a full sprint. The trail curved down through a narrow gully, and I slipped on loose dirt and crashed into a dead tree. My knee twisted, and I couldn't put full weight on it. I pushed on, limping, sweating, barely able to breathe. The sound got closer. Not running, just steady, calm footsteps, like it knew I couldn't get away. I made it to the truck just before noon, threw my gear in the back and peeled out so fast I almost rolled the damn thing on the road. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was 10 miles away. I never went back. I moved out of Denver a few months later, took a new job in Tulsa, started over, left the cabin off the books. I didn't sell it, didn't tear it down. It's still up there, rotting in the trees. Sometimes I still think about that trail cam photo. The way it looked straight at the lens, like it knew it was being watched, like it wanted me to see. I've done a lot of reading since then. Stuff about Navajo legends, missing hikers, Fleshgate sightings, the Skinwalker stories. Most of it sounds like campfire nonsense, but some of the details match. The mimicry, the speed, the way it watches you, learns you. It's not a ghost. It's not magic. It's just something real. Something we haven't figured out yet. Maybe we never will. All I know is it's out there, and it remembers me. I never go near the woods alone now, especially not in Colorado. And if you ever see bare footprints that don't quite look human, leave. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because once it knows you've seen it, it doesn't forget. Ever. I was 34 when I finally decided to take a break from everything. Life back then had started to feel like one of those old air compressors in the factory where I used to work. Always on, always pushing, always a moment away from blowing a gasket. I had spent 12 years in a logistics warehouse just outside of Louisville, Kentucky. Long days, nights alone, and the noise, the constant metallic clanging, the beeping of forklifts, the shouted instructions from supervisors. I needed silence, not peace exactly, just a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. That fall, I drove east into West Virginia, somewhere near Hardy County. I had no specific plan in mind, just a general direction. I packed up my old GMC pickup with some gear, sleeping bag, propane burner, freeze-dried food, my old .22 rifle, and a couple changes of clothes. I brought a cooler, mostly for water. There was no big idea, just drive until the road felt right. It was late October, cold enough that my breath came out in clouds in the mornings, and most of the leaves had fallen from the trees. The wind stirred the branches and kicked dead leaves across the road like little dry ghosts. I'd been driving a narrow, winding route through Monongahela National Forest for maybe 3 hours when I noticed a wide pull-off on the left. Gravel crunching under the tires, I slowed down and turned in. There was an old wooden sign, weathered gray and splintered at the corners, half swallowed by overgrowth. You could still make out some letters under the moss. Pike Ridge, trail access. There was no one else around, no cell reception, and something about the air felt older, not strange, just aged, like dust on an attic trunk. I parked and got out, stretched my legs, and figured I'd hike for a bit. I had my backpack and rifle. After all, I'd set out to get away, and this looked as good a place as any to be gone for a while. The trail was rough and narrow. It hadn't been used much. Branches hung low, and patches of it were swallowed in brush. But there was still a faint path. After maybe an hour of hiking uphill through the thinning woods, I came over a rise and saw it. The cabin. It was tucked into a shallow depression in the terrain, half collapsed into itself and mostly covered in leaf litter and soil runoff. The roof was sunken on one side, and the chimney was leaning hard to the left. The wood siding had gone silver gray with age, the planks warped and split. But what caught my eye was how remote it was. No trails around it, no cleared area or sign of current use. Just this abandoned structure, forgotten in the woods. I don't know what made me walk down toward it. Maybe just curiosity. Maybe because I'd been looking for quiet and this cabin looked like the quietest place on earth. The door was still mostly attached. I gave it a push and it swung open with a groan from the rusted hinges. Inside, it smelled like rot and dirt. The floor was sagging in places, especially near what had once been the hearth. The windows had long since lost their glass, and raccoons or squirrels had clearly made use of the place over the years. I dropped my pack by the door and stood there for a while. The forest outside was completely still.
No breeze, no birdsong.
Just the ticking of a loose board rocking on a nail in the breeze. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I spent the night in the cabin. I cleared a corner in the back, away from the open windows, set up my sleeping bag, lit the small lantern, and unwrapped one of the MREs I'd brought. Beef stew, lukewarm, eaten cross-legged on the dusty floor. The light from the lantern danced on the warped boards. The air inside held a deep, earthy cold, the kind that gets into your joints. I added a thermal liner to my bag and tried to get comfortable. That night, I slept like a man pulled underwater. I woke up with my back stiff and my legs aching. The forest outside was quiet again, but not peacefully quiet. I realized that I hadn't heard a single animal the day before. No crows, no squirrels, not even crickets at night. And that absence sat heavy in the back of my skull. Still, I chalked it up to elevation or time of year. Maybe the cold had pushed the animals lower down the ridges. I boiled some water on the propane burner for coffee and stood just outside the cabin, the metal cup warming my hands. That's when I noticed it. Just to the side of the cabin, about 10 yards away, there was a shallow depression in the ground, almost like a sinkhole, maybe 3 feet wide, perfectly circular. I hadn't noticed it the day before. I walked over, trying to see inside, and realized it wasn't natural. The edge had been lined with smooth stones, like someone had started a well or a pit. And in the center, down maybe 4 feet, was the edge of what looked like a rusted lid or trapdoor, just barely visible through the packed dirt. I didn't touch it. Something about it didn't feel right, like it was meant to stay closed. I spent that day exploring around the cabin, found a path that led a bit further down the ridge, discovered what used to be an old outhouse, just a collapsed frame and pit. Really, I found rusted tools in the brush, a hand saw, a splintered axe handle, a square-headed nail still jammed into a rotted board. Signs that someone had once tried to live here, but it had been a long, long time. I stayed a second night. This time, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft scrape, like a branch dragged across the outer wall. Then another, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding. I waited, breath shallow, ears straining. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, a thump from behind the cabin. Not heavy, not footsteps, just a thump. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked the back wall. Nothing. No signs of tracks, no branches out of place. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer had wandered close, or a raccoon had knocked over something. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. That third day, I made the mistake of opening the pit. I went back to the depression with a small trowel I kept in my gear. Just to see, I told myself. Just a peek. The dirt was dry and came up easy. After a few minutes of scraping, I uncovered the whole lid. It was circular and metal, maybe 3 feet across. Rusted and dented, with a small iron handle in the center. It took everything I had to pull it up. It creaked and groaned and finally popped open with a sharp metallic clang that echoed across the trees. Inside was a dark shaft, maybe 8 feet deep, and at the bottom, a ladder, wooden, hand-built, still intact. I dropped a small stone and waited. It hit something solid with a faint thud. Again, I should have walked away, but curiosity's a strange thing. I climbed down. The air changed as I descended, got colder, heavier. The walls of the pit were packed dirt, and near the bottom they opened into a small crawl space. I squeezed into it. The flashlight beam bounced off something in the far corner. Metal, a chest, or rather a strongbox, about the size of a cooler. I dragged it back to the ladder and lifted it up into the sunlight. The box was locked, but the lock had rusted through and crumbled with enough force. I pried it open. Inside were papers, dozens of them, wrapped in oilskin and bound with twine. There was also a leather-bound notebook, warped with age but still legible. Inside were pages and pages of tight, slanted handwriting. It was a journal. The entries started in 1939. I read the whole thing over the next day and a half. The man who had lived here was named Albert Dunning. He'd been a logger, said he built the cabin with his own hands after leaving a logging crew in Elkins. He wrote about trapping, logging, and how he'd been trying to escape something. He never said exactly what, but as the entries went on, his tone changed. He started writing about people coming onto the land at night, about noises outside, about tools going missing, then about someone watching him. No names, no details, just fear. The last entry was dated April 1943. He wrote, "I sealed the pit. If they come, they won't find me. I've taken everything down there. No one will find it. No one will find me." That was it. No mention of who they were, or what it was. That night, I barely slept. The forest felt tighter around the cabin, like it was leaning in, like the trees had grown an inch closer. I kept the lantern on until it ran out of fuel, sat with my back against the wall and the rifle across my lap. And then, just before dawn, I heard it. Footsteps, not animals, not the wind. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps came closer, then paused just outside the window. I waited. Then they moved again around the back, then gone. I waited another hour before stepping outside. Nothing. No prints. No sign of anything. I packed my gear. I put the journal back in the box, closed the pit and covered it with dirt again. I hiked back out that morning. No breaks. No stops. Just 7 miles down that ridge and back to the truck. I never told anyone, not until now. Sometimes, when the air is real still and I can't sleep, I think about those footsteps, about the journal, about how someone else had been out there in that forest 70 years ago, hearing the same sounds, seeing the same things. The cabin's still out there, rotting quietly into the ridge. And so is the pit. I didn't go back. I won't. Some places are better left quiet. It was late September of 2016 when I agreed to help a friend with a small land surveying job up in northern Idaho, close to the Canadian border. I was 34 at the time, working odd construction and forestry gigs, mostly seasonal. I had a bit of carpentry background and didn't mind being out in the woods, even in colder months. My buddy, Alan, had been hired to map out a large patch of private land for a real estate firm that wanted to parcel it off for luxury cabins. He offered me $1,000 to help carry gear and mark coordinates with him over 4 days. I said yes before asking too many questions. The property was up near Priest Lake, several miles past the last small town, a place called Coolin. Once we got up into the hills, cell service dropped off completely, and the roads turned rough and narrow. A beat-up logging road led into the heart of the parcel, around 9,000 acres of dense pine, steep hills, and rocky clearings. The area was mostly untouched, just trees and old survey tape from decades earlier. We arrived in Alan's truck and hiked half a mile to an old one-room cabin built in the 70s. It had been used off and on by surveyors over the years. Just a rectangle of rough-cut pine logs, a tin roof, and a wood stove. No electricity, no plumbing, but it was dry and warm with enough firewood stacked to last a week. That was where we'd be staying while we worked. I'd never heard of the property owner, but apparently he was some rich guy from Arizona who bought up thousands of acres up north. Never visited, never built anything. Just wanted the land parceled out so he could sell pieces. We arrived on a Monday. Alan planned for us to be done by Thursday evening. He had all the GPS gear, flags, and maps. I just helped carry and mark terrain. It was grueling work, climbing ridgelines, scrambling over rocks, and bushwhacking through dense brush, but I didn't mind. The air was crisp, smelled of pine and cold earth. I liked the silence. I liked the stillness. That first day went fine. We made it back to the cabin around 5, started a fire, and cooked canned chili over the propane stove someone had left behind. That night, as I lay in the bunk with my sleeping bag zipped up to my chin, I remember how utterly black it was outside. No stars, no moon, just thick trees pressing in from every side. The wind moaned through the pines and tapped branches against the walls. I fell asleep easy though. Exhaustion does that. Day 2, Alan twisted his ankle early on. Nothing major, but bad enough that he couldn't hike the distances we'd planned. He decided to stay near the cabin and work on organizing the maps while I did some of the flagging myself. I wasn't thrilled. Being alone in the woods that far out isn't something I'd recommend, but we were behind schedule and I wanted to keep things moving. That afternoon, about 2 miles east of the cabin, I was working through a rocky slope, placing pink flagging tape on tree trunks where Alan had noted the coordinates. The terrain was steep and footing was tricky. I remember stopping to drink some water and heard something off to my right, maybe 30 or 40 yards down the hill. I froze. It was a sharp crack like a stick snapping under weight. Then silence. My first thought was bear, but there was no huffing, no movement after. I scanned the woods but didn't see anything. Maybe it was just a branch falling. Happens all the time out there. Still, I worked quicker after that. Didn't want to be out there alone much longer. By the time I got back, it was almost dark. Alan was inside, ankle up, drinking powdered coffee. He said he hadn't seen or heard anything. I didn't bring up the snapping sound. I figured it was nothing. That night was colder, the wind louder. At one point, around 3 a.m., I woke up because the metal stovepipe made a loud bang like it had shifted. I sat up and listened. Nothing else. The fire had died down. I tossed a couple logs in and went back to sleep. Wednesday started like the others. Alan's ankle wasn't any better, so I went out alone again. This time west, following a dry creek bed up into a narrow ravine. The area felt different. More closed in, the trees older and thicker. Light barely came through the canopy. I moved carefully, placing flags at each GPS point and double-checking the coordinates against the map. About an hour in, I found something that made me stop cold. There was a clearing, maybe 30 feet across, where several trees had been chopped down. The stumps were old, rotted around the edges. In the center was an old fire pit, ringed with rocks, now cold and full of leaves. But what really got me was what sat near it. Half buried in dirt and moss, a rusted-out camp chair, and next to it, a boot. Just one. Torn at the toe, weathered but not destroyed. It didn't feel like an old campsite. It felt abandoned. Wrong. Like whoever had been there left in a hurry. I took a few steps closer and saw a bundle of faded cloth under some pine needles. I used a stick to poke it aside. It was a flannel jacket. Moldy, ripped. No ID, no wallet. I didn't touch anything else. My stomach was tight the rest of the hike. I got back late. Alan was already asleep. I didn't wake him. I laid in bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself the camp was just old. But I couldn't stop thinking about the boot. Thursday morning, clouds moved in. The wind had picked up. A storm was coming. We decided to pack up that night after the last round of marking. Alan's ankle was still tender, so again, I went out alone. I covered the last sector north of the cabin. Steep country, all moss and granite boulders. Halfway through, it started drizzling. The forest went quiet in that way it does before a downpour. I picked up the pace. That's when I found the second clearing. This one was smaller, no more than 20 feet wide. Same deal, old fire pit, scattered logs. But this one had something the other didn't, a pile of bones. At first I thought they were deer, but the longer I looked, the less sure I became. They were white, picked clean. No flesh, no fur. But the size of some of the long bones. They weren't animal. They looked human. There was no skull, just ribs, femurs, maybe a pelvis. Everything strewn, not in any real pattern. I didn't touch anything, didn't take photos. I just backed away and turned around. I made it back to the cabin around 5. Alan saw my face and asked if I was okay. I just said we needed to leave before dark. He didn't argue. We packed fast, hauled everything to the truck by 6 and drove the hour and a half back down the old logging road in silence. When we reached Coolin, I finally called the sheriff's office on a landline at the gas station, told them what I'd seen. They took down my name and said they'd send someone out. They never followed up with me. 2 weeks later, Alan called and said he heard from the guy who'd hired him. The man had pulled out of the sale, said he didn't want the land surveyed anymore. No explanation, just stopped returning calls. A month after that, Alan's laptop was stolen out of his apartment in Spokane. It had the GPS data and maps from the survey job. No signs of forced entry. I didn't think much more about it until the following spring. I was working a trail maintenance job in Montana when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Later I listened. It was a man's voice, calm, maybe mid-40s. He said my name and told me I shouldn't go back to that land. Said if I talked to anyone else about what I saw, it wouldn't be good for me. Then he hung up. No name, no caller ID. I saved the voicemail. I reported it. Never heard anything back. That was 8 years ago. I still think about those bones. About the camp chairs, the boot, the jacket. I don't know what happened out there or who was using those woods. But it wasn't just hunters or campers. That land felt watched, controlled. I haven't seen Alan since 2019. We keep in touch here and there, but he moved to Oregon, gave up surveying altogether. I don't blame him. I still hike, still go into the woods, but not alone anymore. Never without a signal beacon, and never in Idaho. Whatever was going on out there, it was organized, covered up. People knew and didn't talk. Maybe still don't. I tell this story now because I don't want it forgotten. That cabin is still up there. So are those bones. And maybe the people who put them there. Stay out of the woods where no one goes. Some places don't want you back. I was 37 when it happened. That year, I had decided to take a break from everything. I'd gone through a divorce the year before, and work had been weighing me down. Constant emails, deadlines, people needing something from me all the time. I worked in IT for a logistics firm in Leeds, and most days blended into each other. Same screen, same faces, same long commutes. After years of it, I just burned out. One morning in late September, I booked 2 weeks off work and decided to spend them somewhere remote, somewhere quiet, far from phone signals and Wi-Fi. I didn't want to see anyone or hear anything except the wind in the trees and maybe some birds. Just peace. I found a listing online for a cabin in the Peak District, near a place called Eam. It wasn't in the village itself, but a few miles from it, tucked into a bit of private woodland on a narrow road that didn't even show up properly on Google Maps. It was advertised as an off-grid, rustic experience. No internet, no TV, no neighbors. Just a stove, a wood burner, and a bed. That's exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 13 nights. The owner emailed me with basic instructions, told me to pick up the keys from a lockbox near the gate, and warned me to bring everything I'd need: food, water, firewood, torches. There was electricity, but it came from an old generator I had to switch on manually. The place didn't have a proper address, just a set of directions that led me off a main road, down a narrow lane, and through a barely visible track that twisted through overgrown hedges. Took me a while to find it. I got lost twice. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I parked my car beside the gate, got the key, and walked the last 30 yards up a narrow footpath. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It was a simple single-story building made of dark timber, with a steep roof and a single chimney poking up like a finger. There was only one window at the front, a square one with old glass panes, and a smaller window around the side facing the woods. The door creaked when I opened it, and the place smelled of damp wood and cold air that hadn't moved in a while. Inside, there was a small table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a sagging bed against the far wall. The generator was out back in a wooden shed and worked fine after a few pulls. The lights flickered when I turned them on, but they held. I brought my bags in, locked the door, lit the stove, and opened a tin of beans I'd brought. That first night, I felt relief. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about anything but how quiet it was. The first couple of days were peaceful. I went for walks in the woods, made coffee on the stove, and sat reading in a chair on the front step. There was a small creek down a slope to the south, and a broken-down stone wall ran along the far edge of the clearing. The woods were thick, with ash and birch trees clustered tight together, and their leaves had already turned gold and red. On the 4th night, I noticed something odd. It was about 10:30. I was reading in bed, using a battery lamp because the generator cut off after 10 every night. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the trees knock and groan. I heard what sounded like footsteps on leaves, slow, crunching ones. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe a fox. The cabin didn't have curtains, and I didn't bother covering the window. I got up and walked over to it to check. There was someone standing out there. Took me a few seconds to really process it. She was on the edge of the tree line, barely visible under the moonlight, just a dark figure with long hair hanging straight down. I couldn't see her face properly. She wasn't moving. She just stood there. I didn't know what to do. I stared at her for maybe 10 seconds, then reached for the lamp and held it up to the glass. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, but when the light hit the window, I saw her clearer. She was definitely a woman. Pale face, long coat or dress, messy hair. Still not moving. I backed away from the window, heart hammering. My phone was in my bag by the bed. I grabbed it, unlocked it, no signal, of course. I went back to the window. She was gone. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept the lamp on as long as the battery lasted. I told myself it was probably a local, maybe someone hiking or walking a dog, but she hadn't looked like that. She hadn't looked like she belonged out there. The next morning, I searched the woods where I'd seen her. I didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone walking through. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and I would have seen prints if someone had been there. But there was nothing. I convinced myself I was overtired. Maybe it had been my imagination. A shadow, a tree stump, something that looked like a person. That's what I told myself. But then things started getting worse. 2 nights later, I heard knocking. It was after midnight. No wind, no rain, just silence. Then 3 knocks. Not loud, but sharp. I was awake in bed, half asleep. I froze. The knocks came again, 3 taps, slow and deliberate. I sat up and held my breath. Nothing for a while. Then again. 3 knocks. They were coming from the side of the cabin, near the smaller window. I didn't move. Couldn't. I just sat there for an hour, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up. In the morning, I checked the side of the cabin. There were faint smears on the window, like fingers had been dragged across the glass. Long, thin streaks, not something a branch would do. From that day, I kept the generator running as long as I could. I closed the shutters at night. I stopped going for walks. I kept a fire poker beside the bed. I didn't sleep properly for days. On the 9th night, I saw her again. It had been raining all day. I hadn't gone outside except to refill the generator fuel. That night, I was sitting at the table trying to read when I looked up and saw her. She was standing at the front window, maybe 3 feet away, staring directly in. I froze. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Her face was pale and streaked with what looked like dirt or dried blood. Her eyes were wide, dark, and strange. Her hands were resting lightly on the glass. Her nails were long and cracked. I didn't go near the window. I stood up, backed away slowly, and grabbed the fire poker. I went to the side of the cabin where the door was, locked it again, and stood in the kitchen area waiting for her to move. After a minute or 2, she turned slowly and walked away, not into the trees but around the cabin toward the back. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, she was gone. There were footprints in the mud outside, bare feet. Thin, bony ones. I packed everything and left that morning. I didn't care that I had 4 nights left. I drove straight out, down the narrow road, back onto the main road, and didn't stop until I reached a petrol station near Sheffield. I called the cabin owner later that day, told him someone had been on the property. He sounded surprised but said there had been no complaints before. I didn't tell him everything. I just said someone was watching the cabin at night. He refunded the last 4 days without much argument. I stayed in a Travelodge for the last few days of my break. I didn't tell anyone about what happened until months later. Even then, I kept it short. But the thing that still stays with me, more than her face at the window, more than the knocks or the footprints, was what I found under the bed that last morning before I left. I was packing up my rucksack, checking to make sure I hadn't dropped anything. I knelt beside the bed and looked underneath. There was a folded up piece of fabric, a dress, maybe, dirty, torn, and soaked in something dark. and a small bundle of twigs tied together with string. In the center of the bundle, someone had wedged a tooth. Not a fake one, a real yellow tooth. I didn't touch it. I just left it there and walked out. I've never gone back to that area. I still get shivers when I drive through the peaks. I don't go to remote places anymore. I stay near people, near lights, near places with phone reception. I don't know who she was, or why she came to that cabin, or how long she'd been watching it. Maybe she was just someone who lived rough in the woods. Maybe she had mental problems. Maybe it was something worse. But I know what I saw, and I know she was real. The worst part? That cabin is still online, still listed for rent. Same photos, same instructions, but there's nothing in the listing about the woman in the window. It was the spring of 1997 when I took that job for a few weeks as the caretaker of an old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 32 years old, trying to escape the noise and pressure of city life for a while, wanting nothing but quiet and fresh air. The cabin sat alone, far from the nearest road, surrounded by thick pine and maple trees that still held some brown leaves from the past fall. No phone, no electricity, just the occasional sound of wind through the branches and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I had arrived late afternoon after a long, bumpy drive on a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest. The sun was already dipping low, the sky turning a soft orange, and the air smelled damp and cold. The cabin was small, just one room, a stone fireplace, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. The windows were grimy but intact. A rusty old wood stove sat in the middle of the room. It was the kind of place where the silence felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The first night was mostly uneventful. I chopped wood, made a small fire, and tried to settle in. The wind howled outside, pushing cold drafts through cracks in the walls. I wrapped myself in a worn blanket, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. I felt a little uneasy, the kind of feeling you get when you're alone somewhere unfamiliar, but I told myself it was just nerves. The next morning, I went outside to check the perimeter. The ground was still soggy from last week's rain, and the moss and ferns looked bright green. Not far from the cabin, I found some old animal traps, rusty and unused for years. A few deer tracks were pressed in the mud, but otherwise, the place looked deserted. I had brought supplies, canned food, water, a small first aid kit, some basic tools, planning to stay a month or so. On the third day, the weather turned cold and rainy. The cabin felt colder inside. I stayed mostly inside, reading and fixing some loose boards on the porch. When the rain eased late in the afternoon, I decided to explore a little further. The forest around the cabin was dense, with narrow paths barely visible. I walked slowly, trying to remember the trails on the old map I had been given. That's when I found it, a faint trail leading downhill toward a small creek. The path looked newer, like someone had been using it recently. Curious, I followed it. The creek was narrow, flowing quickly over rocks, with a few fallen logs across it. As I crossed one of the logs, I noticed something strange on the far side of the bank. At first, I thought it was just a pile of branches or old leaves, but as I stepped closer, I saw a hand sticking out. My heart jumped. I froze. The hand was pale, and the fingers were stiff, half covered in mud and leaves. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew what I was looking at. A body, dead, lying face down in the wet dirt beside the creek. I swallowed hard and took a step back. I pulled out my phone, but as I expected, no signal. This place was too far from any tower. My breathing became shallow. I looked around quickly, no one else in sight. The forest was quiet except for the creek's flowing water. I fought the urge to run. After a moment, I forced myself to look more carefully. The body was a man, maybe in his late 40s. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, his boots stuck in the mud. His face was turned toward the creek, but I could see bruises on the back of his head and some dried blood on his shirt. It looked like he had fallen or been pushed. His eyes were closed, mouth slightly open, and the skin pale and waxy from the cold and wet. I searched the area for anything useful, a wallet, ID, anything that could tell me who he was. In his jacket pocket, I found a folded piece of paper with a name and address, but it was only partial, the ink smudged by water. No phone or anything else. I knew I had to act, but with no phone signal and no one around, I was stuck. The nearest road was a good 2 miles away, and the rain was picking up again. I felt trapped. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a stranger? Had he been hurt by accident? Or was this something worse? I didn't want to touch the body, but I knew I needed to keep the area safe, so no one else disturbed it. I marked the spot in my mind and hurried back to the cabin. I locked the door and sat down, my hands shaking. I tried to calm myself, thinking about what to do next. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound outside seemed louder. The cracking of branches, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. I kept looking out the window toward the direction of the creek, wondering if someone would come looking or if whoever had done this was still nearby. The next morning, the rain had stopped. I wrapped myself in my jacket, took my knife, and cautiously headed back to the creek. The body was still there, undisturbed. I took out the paper with the partial address again and tried to memorize it. Then I started walking back toward the dirt road, hoping to find a house or a phone. After a long, slow hike through thick woods and muddy paths, I finally reached the road. It was empty, no cars in sight. I followed it north, walking for nearly an hour until I saw a mailbox with a house number. I ran up the driveway and knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, surprised to see me out here. Without getting into details, I explained the situation and showed her the paper I found. She recognized the name immediately. A man who used to live a few miles down the road, a loner who disappeared about a week ago. She told me she hadn't heard from him and was worried. She called the local sheriff's office for me, and soon 2 deputies arrived. I led them back to the creek where the body was. They took notes, cordoned off the area, and started an investigation. Over the next few days, I learned more. The man had been involved in some trouble, debts, angry neighbors, maybe fights. The bruises suggested he hadn't died of natural causes. The sheriff told me they suspected foul play and were searching for suspects. It was the kind of thing no one expected in this quiet part of the woods. But sometimes violence comes to the loneliest places. I stayed at the cabin a little longer before the investigation wrapped up. The sheriff thanked me for reporting the body and being honest. The whole experience changed me. The woods weren't just peaceful and quiet anymore. They held dark secrets, reminders that danger can be real and close. When I left, the cabin was no longer just a refuge. It became a place where I saw the fragile line between solitude and isolation, peace and fear. I never forgot that pale hand reaching out from the mud. The stillness of a life ended alone. I was 32 the year it happened. Not young enough to be careless, but not old enough to really know better either. I'd grown up around woods and rifles. My dad taught me how to clean a bolt action before I even had a bike. We weren't some kind of hillbilly militia family or anything, just northern Michigan folk who knew the land and respected it. My Uncle Darrell had a hunting cabin tucked back deep off Route 77, about 15 miles east of Ironwood. It sat on a plateau past a winding gravel drive barely wide enough for a truck. He built the thing himself back in the late 80s. For walls, 1 fireplace, no power, no plumbing, just propane and wood. Darrell passed in 19, and since he had no kids, he left the cabin to my dad. My dad didn't care much for hunting anymore. Knees were shot, and he said he'd rather fish than freeze his ass off in a tree stand, so it more or less became mine by default. Every year around mid-October, I take a week off work and head out there for deer season. It was cold, quiet, and exactly what I needed to reset my head after spending most of the year doing freelance IT work in a windowless basement office. That fall in 2021 was no different, but everything else about that trip was. Started off normal. I got there late in the afternoon, unloaded the truck, got the propane heater going. The air was already sharp, maybe low 40s. I remember how loud the leaves were under my boots, dry and brittle. The color had mostly dropped off already. Everything looked dead or dying, but in that beautiful fall way where everything seems to be waiting for snow. I chopped a bit of wood before the sun went down, stacked it near the firebox inside. I liked to sit in the silence for a while before bed. No phone, no light except the lantern and fire glow. That first night passed without anything strange. It was the second morning when things started to feel off. I always did the same loop early in the trip: South Ridge Trail down to the creek basin, then back up the north slope toward the game trail that cut across behind the cabin. It's a good loop, takes a couple hours, and you can sit halfway for a thermos break. I'd only made it about a quarter mile in when I saw the first thing that threw me off. There was a deer carcass, well, what was left of one. The bones were mostly intact, but it had been cleaned of flesh almost surgically. No chew marks, no tearing like coyotes would leave. Just ribs like white fingers reaching for the sky. Blood dried into black patches on the cold dirt. The spine was snapped clean. What got me, though, was the head. It was missing, not chewed off, cut. Clean as hell, like someone had taken a saw to it. The rest of the body wasn't moved much, just lying there like it had dropped on its side and never gotten up. I looked for tracks, but the ground was a mess of leaves and the wind had probably blown anything light away during the night. Still, I didn't love it. I chalked it up to poachers or maybe someone from town being careless with gut piles. I kept walking. I hit the creek basin about 45 minutes later. It had just a trickle of water running through, and I paused there, leaning against a tree, sipping from my thermos. I always felt safe down there. Sunlight filtered in through the narrow cut in the trees, and the wind was blocked by the rise on both sides. But this time, I had that gnawing feeling you get when you know someone's behind you, that itch in the neck that won't go away. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement, no sound. No birds either. That's what finally stood out to me. Not one chirp, not a single flutter. Normally the ravines echoed with squirrel noise and chickadee chatter, but it was dead quiet. Too quiet. I finished my break and moved up the ridge faster than usual. There was still a layer of fog in the air that hadn't burned off, and the sun was dim through the overcast. When I got back to the cabin, I opened a can of chili, sat on the back step, and ate while looking toward the slope. I spotted something, a white spot way off near the treeline. I squinted, then went in and grabbed the small pair of binoculars I kept by the window. When I looked again, the white spot was gone. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a patch of birch bark or maybe sunlight bouncing off a wet rock. Still, it nagged at me. I stayed in the cabin the rest of the day, checking my rifle and gear. That night was harder to sleep through. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something scraping outside. Not big footsteps or anything like that, just faint dragging, like someone pulling something over leaves. I went out twice, rifle in hand, light sweeping over the brush. Found nothing. Saw no tracks in the frost. By the third day, I was spooked, but too proud to leave. I told myself it was just an animal or a poacher messing around. I still planned on bagging a buck and not wasting my time out here. The next morning, I went up toward the western ridge where there were known to be some old tree stands from Daryl's days. I took a side path I hadn't used in years, hoping maybe fewer people meant more deer. What I found instead was an old, rusted truck cab halfway down the ravine. It was buried in vines and debris, and I didn't remember it from before. Not surprising. Daryl had told me there were a few abandoned vehicles and logging trailers out here from back in the day. But this one was different. The windows were all busted out, and the driver's door was missing. Inside, I saw a bedroll and a few rusted cans. Recent. Too recent. One had a best by date from only a year ago. The other thing that made my stomach turn was the blood on the inside roof. A smear. Dried, but definitely blood. Not animal blood either. I know the difference. I backed away and left fast. Didn't even think about hunting anymore. I walked back slow, trying not to make noise. I didn't want whoever might have been staying there to know I'd found their spot. If they were watching, they'd know I wasn't supposed to. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with the rifle in my lap, lantern off. I heard movement outside around midnight. Something shuffled past the side window. I didn't breathe. The steps paused by the door, then moved away. I counted slowly in my head until dawn. When light finally came, I walked the perimeter. I found no tracks, but I did find something worse. Hanging on a nail near the shed was a piece of raw meat. At first, I thought someone was trying to dry venison, but it wasn't cut right. It was gray, stringy, and had black hair stuck to it. Could have been from a raccoon, but I wasn't sure. The nail had never been there before. That was it for me. I started packing. I didn't care how much gas I had left or that I hadn't gotten a deer. I threw everything in the truck and locked the cabin. As I got behind the wheel, I looked once more toward the ridge. There was someone standing just at the edge of the trees, too far to make out features. Just tall, wearing dark clothes, maybe a hood. Not moving. I drove. Didn't stop until I was 20 miles out and could see the lights of Ironwood again. I stayed in a motel that night and didn't sleep anyway. Kept checking the parking lot through the blinds like a paranoid idiot. Later, I told the local DNR office what I found. The truck, the meat, the weird signs. They said they'd send someone to check. I never followed up. I didn't want to know. I haven't been back to the cabin since. My dad still asks if I want to go up every fall. I always say I'm too busy with work. Truth is, I sold my rifle last year. Haven't hunted since. I moved out of Michigan a few months after that trip and live in Arizona now. Some nights I still wake up thinking I hear leaves being dragged. Some part of me still thinks that figure at the edge of the trees had been watching me for longer than I realized. Maybe from the first day. Maybe for years before that. Maybe Daryl didn't die of a stroke like they said. I don't know, but I'll never go back to that ridge. Ever. I had been looking forward to the weekend for months. A small trip away from the city noise and the stress of my job. I was 32 years old then, working a job in IT that drained more of me every day. The plan was simple. Drive up to a remote cabin I rented for 3 days, spend time alone, unplug from everything and just be. No phone, no internet, no work emails. Just me, the woods, and a few books. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It was an old, modest structure, just enough to keep out the cold, with wood walls and a stone fireplace that looked like it belonged to another century. I found it listed on a small rental website. The photos showed a small porch, a rustic interior with a wood stove, and a lake about a mile away. Perfect. I left Friday morning just as the sun was rising, with my backpack, some food, and my camping gear packed neatly in my car. The drive was quiet and beautiful, trees lining the road thick and tall, turning bright shades of red and orange with the coming fall. When I arrived at the dirt road leading to the cabin, the asphalt disappeared, and I had to drive carefully on a narrow, uneven track. I felt the excitement mix with a nervous knot in my stomach. The cabin sat nestled between towering pines, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and something older, something untamed. I parked near the porch and stepped out. The wood under my boots creaked softly, and I could hear the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the trees. Inside, the cabin was chilly, the air still heavy with the dampness of the previous week's rain. I opened the windows to air it out, and as sunlight filtered through the curtains, the dust motes danced in the beams. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed, and the stone fireplace with its iron grate. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a gas stove, and a cold water tap. No electricity, no running water besides what the sink could deliver, no phone signal either. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, built a small fire in the fireplace, and read a book about the history of the region. The solitude was peaceful but also strange. There was an overwhelming silence that filled every corner, interrupted only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the distant rustle of animals outside. That night, after a simple dinner of canned soup warmed over the stove, I settled into the bed with a thick blanket. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up, the pine trees outside whispering like old friends exchanging secrets. I slept fitfully, waking a few times to the sound of branches scraping against the roof. The next morning, I woke early, the sun just rising through the window. I stepped outside and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, and the smell of wet pine was stronger after the night's rain. I decided to explore the area. The lake, I remembered, was about a mile away, so I grabbed my jacket and set off down the narrow path. The woods were dense but not overgrown. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and every step left a faint crunch. As I walked, I noticed how still the forest was. No birds singing, no animals rustling nearby. It was like the woods were holding their breath. When I reached the lake, the water was dark and still, reflecting the gray morning sky. I sat on a rock near the edge and took in the silence. It felt different here, heavier somehow, like the kind of silence that presses down on your chest. I stayed there for nearly an hour before heading back to the cabin. Back inside, I started a fire again. The warmth was comforting against the chill that crept in as the day wore on. I prepared some coffee on the stove and settled in by the window. As the afternoon stretched, the weather shifted, the sky darkened, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. By evening, the rain had started soft at first, then growing heavier. The drops pattered against the roof, and the wind howled through the trees. I could hear the branches scraping more urgently now, as if something was trying to get inside. It was a sound I'd never heard before, sharp and almost desperate. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked tight, the old wood swelling with moisture but holding firm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was broken only by the storm, but I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting just beyond the porch light. I tried to focus on reading, but the unease grew with every minute. The fire flickered, casting large shadows on the walls that seemed to move like living things. The wind's howl was louder now, mixed with a faint scratching at the back door. I stood up and walked over, my heart pounding. I peered through the small window in the door but saw nothing but the rain. Still, the scratching continued, soft but insistent. I pulled the curtain back a little and shone my flashlight outside. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the edge of the woods. I froze. The eyes blinked slowly, and then a large figure stepped forward. Dark fur, tall, hunched over. It was a bear. My stomach dropped. The bear stood still for a moment, then padded away silently into the trees. I let out a slow breath, my heart racing. I hadn't expected to see wildlife that close, especially not at night. The storm raged on until past midnight. I stayed awake, watching the fire, listening to the sounds of the woods. I kept my hunting knife close, though I doubted it would do much good. Still, The thought of the bear lurking nearby made sleep impossible. The next day dawned cold and wet. The storm had passed, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. I decided to spend the day cleaning and exploring the cabin's small storage shed, hoping to distract myself from the night's fears. The shed was small and filled with old tools, some rusted and forgotten. As I moved through it, I found a small locked box tucked in the corner. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, there were faded photographs, yellowed papers, and an old journal. The journal belonged to the cabin's original owner, a man named Harold who had lived there in the 1940s. His writing was careful but urgent, filled with descriptions of the area, the wildlife, and his years alone in the woods. But the last entries were strange. He wrote about hearing footsteps outside his cabin at night, about missing tools and food, and about a shadow man who watched from the trees. I felt a chill reading those words. No ghosts, just a man's fear of being watched. I put the journal down and tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just his imagination or loneliness getting to him. That afternoon, I decided to hike a little further into the forest, staying on marked trails this time. The woods were thick, and the damp earth soaked my boots. As I walked, I noticed signs of someone else having been there recently: broken branches, footprints in the mud. I followed the footprints cautiously. They led deeper into the woods, toward an old fire pit surrounded by stones. Nearby, I found a torn backpack, half buried under leaves. My stomach sank. Someone had been here recently and left in a hurry. I spent the rest of the afternoon retracing my steps back to the cabin, glancing nervously behind me. When I got back, I locked every door and window and sat by the fire, staring into the flames as dusk fell. That night was worse than the last. The silence of the woods was replaced by distant noises, snapping twigs, low growls, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking underfoot. The bear had not returned, but something else was out there. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside again, slow and deliberate. They circled the cabin, stopping sometimes, moving on. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, shining the beam around, but I saw nothing but the shifting trees. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, stopping just beyond the edge of the porch. I stayed inside, my back against the door, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things quickly. I didn't feel safe here anymore, not with the unknown presence lurking in the woods. On my way back to the car, I stopped at the small town and told the local sheriff about the footprints and the backpack. They took me seriously, saying that people sometimes pass through those woods, some not friendly. They warned me to be careful if I ever came back. I never did return to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because the wilderness has its own dangers. The unknown people, the wild animals, the isolation that can make your mind turn against you. That trip taught me that sometimes the scariest thing is not what you see or hear, but what you can't see. The silence, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. I still think about that place, and sometimes I wonder who else might be out there in those woods, watching from the darkness, waiting for the next person to come alone. I was 34 when I took the job. It was 2022, late September. The leaves had already turned, and the cold had started settling in the way it always does in northern Ontario. Quiet, slow, and final. The trees go from bright gold to a sick sort of orange, and then they just drop everything and wait. Same thing I was doing, I guess, waiting. The guy who hired me was a logger who wanted a small off-grid hunting cabin built deep into a piece of inherited land. He didn't give a lot of instructions, just measurements, materials dropped off ahead of time, and a rough sketch of what he wanted. He wouldn't be around. I was to build it alone. It wasn't the first time I'd done something like that. I'd worked a lot of odd construction jobs, and sometimes the solitude was nice. He told me the land was remote. No cell signal, no roads past a certain point. I'd need to park about a kilometer up the logging path and then walk the rest of the way in. There was a small clearing marked with orange tape on trees. That's where the cabin would go. The pay was decent, and I had no reason to turn it down. I had been drifting for a while, mostly sleeping in my truck or crashing at my cousin's. This seemed like a good way to get some money together before winter. I got there late in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The sun was already low. The air had that cold bite it gets when the day's ending fast. I parked where the trail ended and loaded my gear into a small sled I could pull behind me. Took about 45 minutes to get to the clearing. The tarp-covered stacks of wood and tools were already there, just like he'd said. The trees around the clearing were dense, black spruce and pine mostly. The only break in them was the logging trail behind me, and even that disappeared fast if you walked too far. The quiet out there wasn't peaceful. Felt wrong, like the woods were listening. It was too quiet. I've spent time in the bush before, and you usually hear animals, wind, trees moving. Here, nothing. Just damp silence. The kind that presses into your ears. Still, I got to work. That first night, I set up my own small canvas tent and a wood stove. The air dropped below freezing after dark, and a fine mist settled over everything. I barely slept. The sound of water dripping off the trees kept me half awake. Not because it was loud, because I kept thinking it wasn't just water. Day one was mostly layout, getting the perimeter marked, checking the level of the ground. It had rained before I arrived, and the soil was soft. My boots sank an inch with every step. I had to dig out roots, remove small rocks, get the site ready. I worked until dusk, hands numb and soaked from the wet dirt. That night, it rained harder. I remember lying in my tent, staring up at the canvas, watching the way the lantern light moved on the fabric. The wind picked up around midnight, and the trees started to groan. Long, slow creaks like something shifting its weight. That sound gets into your head when you're alone. You start wondering if it's just wind. You start wondering if you made a mistake coming. I got up early on day 2. Everything was soaked again. My hands were raw from the day before. I got the base frame in, digging footings by hand since there was no way to get machinery out there. I had 4 6x6s sunk into the ground, leveled them out, and got the joists started. My shoulders ached from the cold and the weight of the lumber, but I kept my head down and moved through it. That evening, it rained again. Constant now. The kind of rain that doesn't even feel like drops. Just wet air pressing into everything. My clothes never dried. My hands were splitting, skin around the nails cracked open. Still, I kept working. That third night, something changed. I was trying to sleep again, but I kept hearing this soft dragging sound outside the tent. At first, I thought it was a branch, but it was rhythmic, slow, something being pulled through the mud. I didn't move. I didn't breathe, just waited. It stopped after maybe 10 seconds. Then nothing. I figured maybe it was a deer or a porcupine nosing around, but it didn't feel right. In the morning, I found tracks. Not animal ones. Not boot prints either. Something wide had been dragged in the mud, arcing around my tent and then back toward the trees. I followed it for about 10 feet before it disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't go further. I didn't want to know. I convinced myself it was a fallen branch that had been moved by the wind. But I didn't believe it. I got back to work. The frame was done now, and I started getting the walls up. The plywood was waterlogged and heavy, but I lifted them alone, nailing them into place. Every thud of the hammer echoed out into the woods like it didn't want to be there. Every sound came back wrong. It was like the trees swallowed it differently each time. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern on, sitting up in my sleeping bag, hand on the hatchet I kept next to me. I listened. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that dragging again, closer this time, It stopped right outside the tent. Then I heard breathing. Not loud, just the sound of air moving. Slow, wet. I froze. After a long minute, it moved away. The next morning, I didn't find tracks. Nothing. The mud was smooth. I tried to believe I'd imagined it, that my brain was playing tricks from the stress and the cold. But I knew I hadn't. I kept building. By day 5, the walls were up, the roof frame in place. Rain never stopped. My skin was pale and waterlogged. Every nail I drove in felt like a choice I couldn't undo. Like I was locking something in place that didn't want to be there. I didn't think about quitting. I didn't have anywhere to go anyway. The final straw came that night. I woke up to the sound of something being moved. Not outside. Inside the half-built cabin. The rain was softer that night, more like a mist again. I stepped out of the tent and stood in the dark, not even bothering with the lantern at first. I just listened. There was a scraping sound inside the cabin, like something being dragged across the wood floor. I walked toward it slowly, boots sinking into the mud with every step. When I reached the doorway, I froze. Inside, in the faint light of the sky, I saw something hunched in the corner. Couldn't make out details, just the shape. Broad shoulders, elbows high. It moved slow, shifting in the corner like it was turning to face me. I didn't move, couldn't, and then it was gone. I didn't see it leave. It just wasn't there anymore. The cabin was empty. I stood there for a long time, rain dripping from the rafters, soaking the wood. My legs were locked in place. When I finally moved, I went back to the tent, packed my things, and left. I left everything, the tools, the materials, even my own gear. I walked back down that path in the dark, through the rain, dragging my sled behind me. It felt lighter than it should have. I didn't look back. I didn't tell the guy who hired me why I didn't finish. I just said I got sick. He didn't push. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he didn't care. 2 months later, he emailed me a photo. The cabin was finished. Not by me, not by him. No one had hired anyone else. But the photo showed it done. Roof on, windows in, door bolted shut. No tracks around it. No tire marks. No footprints. Just the cabin, sitting alone in the clearing like it had grown out of the ground. I didn't reply. I've taken other jobs since then. Always closer to town. Always around people. I still build cabins sometimes. But I never go too far in. Never past where the road ends. Because some places don't want you there. And some things finish what you start. It was late October 2003 when I finally got the chance to escape the city and head to my uncle's cabin deep in the forests of northern Minnesota. I was 32 at the time, tired of the noise, the endless traffic, the constant buzz of work emails and ringing phones. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful place, somewhere I could spend a few days off the grid, clear my head, and maybe do some writing. I'd been putting off the trip for months, but finally, I took the week off and packed my old Jeep with blankets, a few canned goods, and a couple of books. I figured a little solitude would do me good. The drive from Minneapolis was long, almost 5 hours through winding roads that got narrower and rougher the further north I went. The closer I got, the more the trees closed in around me. Dense pines and maples with leaves that had just started to turn red and orange. It was the kind of scenery that looked like a postcard, but as the sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows grew long, and the woods seemed less inviting. Still, I kept driving until I saw the familiar sign that said, Pine Hollow Cabin, Private Property. The cabin itself sat at the end of a gravel driveway, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. It was a modest, weathered log cabin, built sometime in the late 60s, with a stone chimney, a small porch and windows that reflected the last light of day. My uncle had passed away a few years before, but he left the place to me. He'd always said it was a good spot to be alone with your thoughts. Now I was finally here. I parked the Jeep and stepped out, the crisp air biting at my face. The silence was almost complete, just the occasional rustling of leaves and a far-off crow calling. No city sounds, no planes, no cars. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and pine needles, mixed with a faint scent of my uncle's tobacco pipe, as if he might walk in any moment. Inside, it was small but cozy. A wood stove in the corner, a couch with a thick knitted blanket tossed over it, a kitchen table cluttered with a few dishes and an old radio. There was a small loft for sleeping and a window that looked out over the trees. I dropped my bags by the door and started a fire in the stove, stacking dry logs I found in a corner. As the fire caught, the room warmed quickly, and I sat down with a mug of coffee. Outside, dusk settled into darkness, and the woods became a black wall around me. That first night was quiet, but not in the comforting way I had hoped. Every small noise, a branch snapping, the wind rattling the windows, sounded sharp and unexpected. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the forest settling for the night, but I found it hard to relax. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I knew there was a small lake about a mile from the cabin. The trail was faint but visible, weaving between thick trees and over moss-covered rocks. The forest was beautiful, the kind of untouched nature you never really see near a city. I took my camera and some snacks, planning to spend the afternoon wandering and maybe taking some photos. As I walked, I noticed signs that I wasn't the only one around. Old tire tracks in the dirt, broken branches where something heavy had pushed through, a couple of empty beer cans half buried in the moss. It made me wonder who else came out here and why they left the trash behind. The lake was calm and dark, surrounded by trees that dipped their branches into the water. I sat on a fallen log at the shore and took a few pictures. The air was still, but I felt like I was being watched. There was no one else around, but I kept hearing the faint crunch of leaves behind me, just out of sight. Every time I turned, nothing was there. I stayed until the light faded, then made my way back to the cabin. By the time I arrived, the sun was low again, and the woods seemed to close in even more. That night, the noises got worse. I couldn't tell if it was animals or something else. There was a scraping sound against the cabin walls, low and slow, like someone running their fingernails across the wood. I checked all the doors and windows locked tight. I thought maybe it was a deer or a bear, but the sound didn't match any animal I knew. It was deliberate, almost taunting. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was impossible. I kept waking up, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to return. The third day, I found some tracks in the mud near the back of the cabin. They were fresh and large, bigger than a man's boot, but not animal prints. The shape was odd, wider at the front, almost like a work boot but distorted. It gave me a chill. Whoever was here, I wasn't alone. I debated leaving, but the nearest town was still hours away. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. I told myself to stay calm, to rationalize it. Maybe hunters came by and left the cans and tracks. That afternoon, while chopping wood for the stove, I heard a car on the gravel road. Relief hit me like a wave. Someone was finally coming. I ran to the porch, waving my arms. The car stopped about 50 feet from the cabin. A man stepped out, tall, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked like a hunter or a woodsman, dressed in worn jeans and a thick jacket. He didn't say anything, just stared. I realized I had no way to explain why I was there or ask who he was. Something about his silence and his cold eyes made me uneasy. He turned and walked toward the trees, disappearing from view. I followed him a few steps but stopped. He never looked back. I stood there, heart hammering. The feeling I had the night before came back, stronger, like I was being watched, like I was a target. I hurried inside and locked the doors again. That night, the sounds came back, louder and more insistent. Scraping on the windows, slow footsteps circling the cabin, the faintest whisper of breath on the back porch. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly and headed for the Jeep. As I walked down the driveway, I noticed fresh tire tracks, different from the ones I saw before, and a single set of footprints heading into the woods. I got into the Jeep, started the engine, and backed out onto the road. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees watching me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour down the road, where I called my friend to pick me up. Looking back, I think the man I saw was some local who didn't like strangers in the woods. The noise at night was probably him trying to scare me off. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was something worse. A reminder that out here, in the middle of nowhere, you're not always alone. And sometimes the real danger is people. It was early October of 2019 when I found myself driving down the old gravel road that cut through the thick woods just outside of Ashland, Oregon. The sun was starting to dip behind the tall pine trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the path in front of me. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying leaves. I hadn't planned to drive this far. Really, I was on my way home from a friend's birthday party, but some force inside me had nudged me to take this longer route. The road narrowed and became rougher. I recognized the place immediately, my ex-husband's cabin. The memory hit me hard. The years we spent there, the fights, the silence that eventually grew between us like an unshakable fog. It was strange how the cabin still looked untouched, almost frozen in time. The paint was peeling in spots, and the wood had turned a dull gray from years of rain and snow. But the windows, oddly, were intact and clean, as if someone had been looking after it. I slowed the car and pulled off to the side, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. My heart raced, a mix of anxiety and something I couldn't quite name. Maybe curiosity, maybe regret. The cabin was small, a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney that had once been my favorite place to sit by the fire on cold winter nights. I hadn't been here since our last fight years ago, when I packed my things and left for good. I got out of the car, the cold air biting my cheeks. The forest around me was quiet, except for the soft rustle of wind through the leaves and the distant call of a crow. I stared at the cabin, trying to remember the last time I had been here, the last time I had stepped through that door. Felt like a lifetime ago. I walked slowly toward the porch, each step crunching on the dry leaves scattered there. The porch light was off, but I could see the outline of a rocking chair where I used to sit, knitting or just watching the stars. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet, worn by years of use. I reached out to touch the door handle. It was cold, but surprisingly, it turned easily. The door opened with a soft groan. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and something else, dust mixed with faint traces of smoke. It was exactly how I remembered it, but somehow smaller, emptier. The fireplace was cold and dark, the hearth covered in ash. The furniture was the same. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a single bed pushed into the corner. Everything coated with a thin layer of dust. No sign of life, no sign that anyone had been here recently. I stepped inside, the floor creaking again. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the uneasy feeling growing inside me. The cabin felt too quiet, too still. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I moved to the window and looked out. The forest was darkening fast, the shadows growing longer, deeper. The wind picked up and rattled the window panes, sending a shiver down my spine. I closed the curtain slowly, the fabric whispering against the glass. I decided to stay a moment longer to see if I could shake the strange tension I felt. I walked over to the table and found an old, faded photograph lying face down. I picked it up and flipped it over. It was a picture of us taken here in front of the cabin. We were younger, happier looking, or so it seemed now. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling the slight crinkles from time. Suddenly, a noise came from outside, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. My heart jumped into my throat. I stood frozen, listening hard. The noise repeated, this time closer. My eyes darted to the window. The forest outside seemed darker now, almost black. The shadows moved. Something was out there. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The feeling of being watched, the sensation of unseen eyes tracking me. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away from the window and moved toward the door, the sense of danger growing. The snapping noise came again, but this time from the side of the cabin. I could hear heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves. Someone or something was moving closer. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking. No signal. The screen stayed blank. I dropped it on the floor. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The silence was thick, oppressive. Then a soft tapping at the window made me jump. I looked up. Nothing. I opened the curtain a crack. There was a man standing just outside, barely visible in the failing light. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hat pulled low over his face. He didn't move, just stared at the window. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The man turned and walked away slowly, disappearing into the trees. I stood there trembling, watching until the shadows swallowed him. The night came quickly after that. I didn't want to stay, but the car was parked too far away, and the road was treacherous in the dark. I found a blanket on the bed and wrapped myself in it, sitting by the window. Every creak, every whisper of the wind made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about that man and why he was watching the cabin. Around midnight, I heard voices far off, but no one came close. The forest seemed alive with noises I didn't recognize. Animals moving, leaves shifting, branches breaking. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten with the first signs of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I got in my car without looking back. The feeling of being watched lingered, but I told myself it was over. I was safe on the main road again. Weeks later, I heard from a mutual friend that my ex-husband had sold the cabin. Someone new was living there. The woods had swallowed up my memories, but the feeling of that night stayed with me. A reminder that some places, no matter how familiar, can hold secrets best left alone. The year was 1998. I was 29, working a simple job in the small, quiet town of Pine Hollow, deep in northern Vermont. I'd recently taken a temporary summer job fixing up an old cabin on the edge of a forgotten graveyard, a place no one wanted to be after dark. I didn't have much choice. Cash was tight, and the cabin owner, a distant relative, had offered me a deal I couldn't refuse. Fix the place up, stay there for a few months, and the rent would be free. When I first arrived, the cabin looked like it had been left to rot for decades. The wood was weathered, cracked in places, and the roof sagged under years of snow. It sat right next to the old Pine Hollow Cemetery, a small patch of land surrounded by rusting iron fencing and tall, twisted trees. The graves were old, some dating back to the 1800s, with crumbling headstones and faded names no one remembered. I wasn't superstitious, but the place had an eerie feel even during the day. The wind seemed to whisper through the branches, and sometimes, when the sun hit the graveyard just right, Long shadows stretched across the ground like fingers reaching out. Still, it was a job, and I told myself I was just being tired or imagining things. The first few days were spent cleaning out the cabin. Inside, dust covered every surface, and spider webs hung like curtains in the corners. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and a faint smell of damp wood and mold lingered in the air. There was no electricity or running water, just a small wood stove in the corner and a well outside. I found some old cans of food in the kitchen cupboards, mostly expired, and a cracked enamel mug. At night, I lit candles and a small oil lamp, the flickering light casting large shadows on the walls. The graveyard outside looked even more ominous in the dark, the tall headstones silhouetted against the moonlit sky. I kept the windows shut tight, trying to ignore the sounds outside. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and sometimes footsteps. But those, I told myself, were animals. On the third night, I heard its slow, heavy footsteps just beyond the fence. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The wind was strong, carrying noises from far away, making it hard to tell what was real. But then it came again, closer this time. It wasn't a quick patter like a squirrel or a raccoon. It was deliberate, slow, measured. Someone was walking the edge of the graveyard. I didn't dare open the window. I grabbed my old hunting knife from my pack and stayed silent, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped, then a pause. Then they started again, moving slowly around the fence line, just out of sight behind the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud outside the gate. They were big boots, fresh, and leading away into the woods behind the cemetery. I tried to tell myself it was a hunter or a local kid, but something about the prints unsettled me. They circled the graveyard carefully, like whoever walked there didn't want to be seen. Over the next week, the footsteps came every night. Always slow, always deliberate. I set traps. Nothing dangerous, just wire snares to alert me if someone tried to come close. Nothing ever tripped them, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between trees, or a flash of light reflecting off a metal object. One evening, I decided to explore the graveyard itself. I wanted to see if there was any sign of someone living nearby or using the area. I grabbed my flashlight and my jacket, slipped the knife into my belt, and pushed the gate open. The rusted hinges creaked loudly, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. The moon was just a thin crescent, barely lighting the way. I walked slowly among the stones, stepping carefully over broken graves and fallen branches. The ground was soft and uneven, and the trees closed in tight. It was quiet, too quiet. No animals.
No birds.
Nothing but the sound of my own breathing. At the far end of the graveyard, I saw something strange. A small clearing where the grass was flattened, and the dirt looked freshly disturbed. There were no graves there, just bare earth. I knelt down and ran my hand over the soil. It was loose, like someone had dug a hole recently. I shined my flashlight around but saw no footprints or other signs of passage. I felt a chill run through me. Whoever had been walking around the graveyard was doing more than just wandering. There was purpose here, and I didn't like it. That night, I barely slept. I kept the cabin locked tight and sat by the stove with the knife close. At one point, I thought I heard whispering outside, soft and low. But when I pressed my ear to the window, the sound stopped. Days passed like that, and I became more restless. I found an old, rusted shotgun in the cabin's back room, probably left by some previous occupant. It was jammed and useless, but I kept it anyway, a reminder that I needed to be ready. Then, one afternoon, I found something else. When I went to the well to draw water, I noticed a small pile of stones stacked near the fence, carefully arranged, too deliberate to be natural. Under the stones, I found a crude note, written on a torn piece of paper. The handwriting was messy, but I could make out a few words. Asterisk, leave now. Asterisk, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call someone, but there was no phone, no cell signal. I was alone out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the town police had little interest in a job like this. The feeling of being hunted grew worse. One night, I was woken by a noise, a scraping, like metal against stone. I grabbed my knife and slipped outside, heart pounding. In the moonlight, I saw a figure crouched by the fence, pulling at the iron bars. The person froze when they saw me and disappeared into the trees without a sound. I never saw them again, but I started making plans to leave. Before I could pack, though, something happened. One morning, when I stepped outside, I saw that the gate had been forced open. The fence was bent and twisted in one spot, as if someone had used a crowbar. The graveyard looked disturbed, with broken branches and footprints leading toward the cabin. Inside, I found the front door unlocked, something I always kept locked. My heart sank. Whoever had been stalking me was closer than I thought. I checked the cabin quickly. Nothing was missing, but the drawers had been rifled through, the bed overturned. I knew I couldn't stay. That day, I packed what little I had and started walking toward the main road. I kept looking back, expecting to see someone following me, but the woods were silent, empty. Hours later, I reached the highway and flagged down a passing car. I told the driver everything, and they took me to the police station in Pine Hollow. The police came to the cabin the next day. They found no one there but did find evidence someone had been living in the woods nearby. A makeshift campsite hidden in the trees with food wrappers and clothes. They suspected a local drifter, someone who used the graveyard as a hideout. In the end, I never returned to that cabin. The owner sold the property, and I moved on with my life. But even now, years later, I remember those nights. The feeling of being watched, the footsteps in the dark, and the silent warning to leave. That place wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by something just as real. A human presence lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting, and reminding me that some places are better left alone.